The summer sun beat down on the small park next to Willowbrook neighborhood. 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell laughed as she swung the wooden baseball bat. Her long brown hair flew behind her as she ran to first base. 6 other kids from the neighborhood played with her. They had been playing baseball for over an hour. Sarah loved these summer days. Her father was away with the army and she missed him every day. But playing with her friends made her feel better. Mrs. Rodriguez, her babysitter, watched from a bench nearby. She smiled as the children played and laughed together. "Strike one," called out Tommy, who was 8 years old like Sarah. He threw the ball again. Sarah swung hard but missed. "I'll get it this time," Sarah said with a big smile. She held the bat tight and got ready for the next pitch. That's when Derek Holbrook showed up. Derek worked for the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, or HOA. He wore a uniform that looked like a police uniform. He had a badge on his chest and everything. But Derek was not a real police officer. He just worked for the HOA to make sure people followed the neighborhood rules. Derek was a big man with short gray hair. He was 45 years old and had worked for the HOA for 3 years. Many people in the neighborhood did not like him. He was always angry and mean to everyone. He would yell at people for small things like having their trash cans out too long or parking their cars the wrong way. Today, Derek was in a very bad mood. He had been driving around the neighborhood looking for people who were breaking rules. When he saw the children playing baseball, he got angry. Derek parked his white HOA truck and got out. He walked fast toward the children. His face was red and he looked very mad. "Hey, you kids need to stop right now," Derek yelled as he walked toward them. The children stopped playing and looked at him. Sarah still held the baseball bat in her hands. She did not understand why this man was yelling at them. "What's wrong, mister?" asked Tommy. "We're just playing baseball. You're making too much noise," Derek shouted. "This is against the HOA rules. No loud games are allowed in the park after 2 p.m. Mrs. Rodriguez got up from the bench and walked over. "Excuse me, sir. The children are just playing. They're not being too loud." Derek turned to look at her. His face got even more red. "Ma'am, I am an officer with the HOA. These children are breaking noise rules and using equipment that is not allowed in this park." "Equipment?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. She looked confused. "You mean the baseball bat and ball?" "Yes. No sports equipment is allowed without a permit from the HOA office," Derek said. This was not true, but Derek often made up rules to scare people. Sarah looked scared. She had never seen an adult so angry at children for just playing. "We didn't know we were doing anything wrong," she said in a quiet voice. "Well, now you do," Derek yelled. "Give me that bat right now." "I'm taking it as evidence." Sarah looked at Mrs. Rodriguez. She did not want to give up their bat. It belonged to Tommy's older brother, and they had promised to take good care of it. "Please, mister," Sarah said. "This bat belongs to Tommy's brother. We promised we would be careful with it." Derek got even more angry. "I don't care who it belongs to. Give it to me now." The other children started to look scared too. Some of them began to cry. They did not understand why this man was being so mean to them. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sir, I think you're scaring the children. Maybe we can talk about this calmly." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Derek screamed. His face was now very red and he was breathing hard. "I have the authority to remove any items that are being used to break HOA rules." Derek reached out to grab the bat from Sarah's hands. But Sarah was scared and did not want to let go. She held on tight to the bat. "Let go," Derek yelled as he pulled on the bat. "You're scaring me," Sarah cried. Tears started to run down her face. Derek was much bigger and stronger than Sarah. He pulled hard on the bat, trying to take it away from her. But Sarah held on tight because she was scared and confused. What happened next changed everything. Derek got so angry that he yanked the bat away from Sarah with great force, but he pulled so hard that the bat flew out of his hands. In his anger, Derek swung his arms wildly, and the bat was still in his hand when he swung. The wooden bat hit Sarah right in the head. There was a loud crack sound. Sarah fell to the ground right away. She did not move or make any sound. "Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez screamed. She ran to the little girl. Blood started to come from Sarah's head. Her eyes were closed and she was not moving at all. The other children started screaming and crying. Tommy ran away to get help. The other kids stood there, too scared to move. Derek looked down at Sarah. His face went white. He realized what he had done. The little girl was badly hurt and it was his fault. "Oh no, oh no," Derek said over and over. His hands were shaking. He had never hurt a child before, even though he was often mean to people. Mrs. Rodriguez knelt down next to Sarah. She checked to see if the girl was breathing. Sarah was breathing, but very slowly. Blood was still coming from her head. "Call 911, Mrs. Rodriguez yelled at Derek. "Call for help right now." Derek's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He could not think straight. He had hurt a little girl very badly. His job might be over. He might go to jail. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the phone said. Derek looked at Sarah lying on the ground. He looked at Mrs. Rodriguez trying to help her. He looked at the other children crying and scared. In that moment, Derek made a choice that would make everything much worse. Instead of telling the truth about what happened, he decided to lie. "This is HOA Officer Derek Holbrook," he said into the phone. "I need an ambulance at Willowbrook Park. A child has been injured during dangerous play activities. The children were using unsafe equipment and one of them got hurt." Mrs. Rodriguez looked up at Derek with shock in her eyes. She could not believe what she had just heard. Derek was lying about what really happened. "That's not true," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "You hit her with the bat." But Derek was not listening. He was already making up his story. He was going to say that Sarah got hurt because the children were playing dangerously. He was going to say that he was just trying to keep them safe. The ambulance was on its way. Sarah was still not moving. And Derek's lies were just the beginning of a much bigger problem. As they waited for help to arrive, Derek started to think about how he would tell his story. He did not know that this little girl's father was someone very special. He did not know that his lies would soon be discovered. And he had no idea that what happened today would change many lives forever. The sound of the ambulance sirens got louder and louder. Help was coming for Sarah. But for Derek, his troubles were just beginning. The ambulance arrived at Willowbrook Park with sirens blaring and lights flashing. 2 paramedics jumped out and ran to where Sarah lay on the ground. Mrs. Rodriguez was still kneeling beside the little girl, holding a towel against her bleeding head. "What happened here?" asked the first paramedic, a woman named Lisa Chen. She had been working as a paramedic for 10 years and had seen many injured children. Derek stepped forward before Mrs. Rodriguez could speak. "I'm Derek Holbrook, HOA enforcement officer," he said, pointing to his badge. "These kids were playing with dangerous equipment. This girl got hit in the head with a baseball bat during unsafe play." Lisa looked at Derek, then at Sarah. Something did not feel right about Derek's story, but she had to focus on helping Sarah first. "Can you hear me, sweetie?" Lisa said to Sarah as she checked her pulse. Sarah's pulse was weak and her breathing was shallow. The injury looked very bad. The second paramedic, a man named Robert Martinez, brought the stretcher from the ambulance. "We need to get her to the hospital right now," he told Lisa. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to speak. "That's not what happened. He hit her with the bat." "I saw it." Derek's face turned red again. The woman is confused by all the excitement. "The children were playing dangerously and the girl got hurt. I was just trying to make them stop before someone got injured, but it was too late." Lisa and Robert did not have time to figure out who was telling the truth. Sarah needed medical help immediately. They carefully put her on the stretcher and loaded her into the ambulance. "I'm coming with her," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "I'm taking care of her while her father is away." "Where is her father?" Lisa asked as they got into the ambulance. "He's in the army. He's far away on a mission. I don't even know how to reach him," Mrs. Rodriguez said with tears in her eyes. The ambulance raced toward Regional Medical Center. Inside, Lisa worked to keep Sarah stable. The little girl was unconscious and her head injury looked serious. At the hospital, doctors and nurses were waiting. Dr. Susan Park, the head of emergency medicine, took charge of Sarah's care. 8-year-old girl with head trauma, Lisa reported as they rolled Sarah into the emergency room. Unconscious for about 20 minutes now. Possible skull fracture. Dr. Park looked at Sarah's injury and her face became very serious. "Get her to CT scan immediately. And call neurosurgery." Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the waiting room, crying and trying to figure out how to contact Sarah's father. She had his army phone number, but when she called it, a recording said the number could not be reached. Back at the park, Derek was talking to the police officers who had arrived. Officer Mike Johnson had been a police officer for 15 years. He was used to taking reports about accidents. "So you're saying the children were playing unsafely and the girl got hurt?" Officer Johnson asked Derek. "That's right," Derek said. I arrived to tell them about the noise complaint and found them using dangerous equipment without supervision. The girl was swinging the bat wildly and it hit her in the head. But Officer Johnson noticed something strange. The other children were still at the park with their parents, who had arrived after hearing about the accident. The children kept saying things that did not match Derek's story. The man took the bat and hit Sarah, 8-year-old Tommy told his mother, loud enough for Officer Johnson to hear. Derek quickly spoke up. The children are traumatized and confused. They don't understand what really happened. Officer Johnson made notes in his report, but he also wrote down what the children were saying. He had learned to pay attention when children's stories were different from adults' stories. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Park was looking at Sarah's CT scan with Dr. James Liu, a brain surgeon. "This is a serious injury," Dr. Liu said. "She has a skull fracture and swelling in her brain. We need to operate immediately to relieve the pressure." Mrs. Rodriguez was still trying to reach Sarah's father when a nurse approached her. "Ma'am, we need to get permission for emergency surgery. Do you have any way to contact her father?" "I've been trying," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "He's a soldier and he's on a mission somewhere. I don't know how to reach him." The nurse looked sympathetic. "We'll have to proceed with emergency surgery to save her life. We'll keep trying to contact her father." While Sarah was in surgery, something unexpected happened at the hospital. Margaret Thornton, the president of the Willowbrook HOA, arrived. She was a 55-year-old woman who had been running the HOA for 8 years. She was known for being very strict about rules and for protecting the HOA from any problems. Margaret found Derek in the hospital parking lot. He was pacing back and forth, looking very worried. "Derek, I heard what happened," Margaret said. "Tell me exactly what occurred." Derek told her the same story he had told everyone else. But Margaret was not stupid. She had worked with Derek for 3 years and knew he had a bad temper. "Derek, tell me the truth," Margaret said in a firm voice. "Did you hurt that child?" Derek looked around to make sure no one could hear them. "It was an accident, Margaret. I was just trying to take the bat away from her and she wouldn't let go. When I pulled it away, it hit her in the head." Margaret's face went pale. "You hit a child with a baseball bat?" "It was an accident," Derek said again. "But if people find out what really happened, the HOA could be sued for millions of dollars. My story protects everyone." Margaret thought about this. The HOA had insurance, but a lawsuit from a seriously injured child could cost them everything. All the homeowners in Willowbrook could have to pay huge amounts of money. "What about the security cameras at the park?" Margaret asked. Derek looked confused. "What cameras?" "There are security cameras that watch the park. The HOA put them up last year to watch for vandalism." Derek's face went white. He had forgotten about the cameras. If there was video of what really happened, his lie would be discovered. "We need to check those cameras right away," Margaret said. They drove back to the park. The police were gone and most of the people had left. Margaret and Derek went to the small building where the camera equipment was kept. Margaret looked at the camera system. She was not an expert with computers, but she knew how to use the basic controls. She found the video from that afternoon and watched it. The video clearly showed Derek grabbing the bat from Sarah and then hitting her in the head with it. It showed Sarah falling to the ground and not moving. It showed Mrs. Rodriguez running to help her. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "Derek, this video shows exactly what happened. You attacked that child." Derek looked at the video and felt sick. "Margaret, you have to help me. If this video gets out, I'll go to jail, and the HOA will be destroyed." Margaret stared at the screen. She was seeing a crime that had been committed by someone who worked for her. She knew the right thing to do was to call the police and show them the video, but Margaret was also thinking about the HOA and all the homeowners who trusted her to protect their interests. A lawsuit could force many families to sell their homes. Margaret made a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life. "Derek, we need to make sure this video disappears," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "The camera system has been having problems lately," Margaret said. "Sometimes the recordings get corrupted or erased. It's happened before." Derek understood what she was suggesting. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" Margaret looked at the video one more time. She saw little Sarah getting hit in the head and falling to the ground. She saw the blood and the fear in the other children's eyes. But then she thought about the HOA and the lawsuits and the money. She thought about her own job and reputation. "The system has been acting up all week," Margaret said as she started pressing buttons on the camera controls. "I've been meaning to call the repair company." Within a few minutes, the video was gone. The camera system showed no recordings for that day at all. There, Margaret said. The system malfunctioned again. We'll call the repair company tomorrow. Derek felt some relief, but he also felt very guilty. What if that little girl dies? She won't die, Margaret said, though she was not sure of this. And our story will protect everyone. You were doing your job, trying to keep children safe, and there was an accident. Back at the hospital, Sarah was still in surgery. Mrs. Rodriguez was still trying to contact Sarah's father. She had called the army base where he was stationed, but they said they could not give out information about soldiers on missions. Dr. Liu came out of surgery after 3 hours. Mrs. Rodriguez jumped up when she saw him. How is she? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. The surgery went well, Dr. Liu said. We were able to reduce the swelling in her brain. But she has a serious injury. She's unconscious and we don't know when she'll wake up. Mrs. Rodriguez started crying again. Will she be okay? It's too early to tell, Dr. Liu said honestly. Head injuries can be very unpredictable. She could wake up tomorrow and be fine, or she could have permanent problems. We just have to wait and see. Mrs. Rodriguez sat back down in the waiting room chair. She looked at her phone and tried again to find a way to contact Sarah's father. A little girl was fighting for her life, and her father did not even know what had happened. At the same time, Derek was driving home, thinking about the lie he had told in the video that had been erased. Margaret was also driving home, trying to convince herself that she had done the right thing. The next morning, Margaret Thornton arrived at her HOA office very early. She had not slept well all night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the video of Derek hitting little Sarah with the baseball bat. She kept telling herself that she had done the right thing by erasing it, but deep down she knew it was wrong. Margaret made coffee and sat at her desk. She had been the HOA president for 8 years and had never faced anything like this before. Usually her biggest problems were people who painted their houses the wrong color or left their trash cans out too long. Derek knocked on her office door at 7:30 a.m. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and his hair was messy. Like Margaret, he had not slept at all. How's the girl? Derek asked as he sat down. I called the hospital this morning, Margaret said. She's still unconscious. The doctors say her condition is serious but stable. Derek put his head in his hands. Margaret, I keep thinking about what happened. Maybe we should tell the truth. Margaret looked at him sharply. It's too late for that now, Derek. We already gave our statements to the police. If we change our story now, it will look like we were lying from the beginning. We were lying from the beginning, Derek said quietly. No, Margaret said firmly. We were protecting the community. Think about what would happen if people found out that an HOA employee seriously injured a child. Every news station in the country would be here. Property values would crash. People would lose their homes. Derek knew she was right about the consequences, but he still felt terrible. What if she dies? She's not going to die, Margaret said, though she was not sure of this. Children are strong. She'll recover, and this will all be forgotten. Margaret had already been busy that morning. She had called the HOA's insurance company and spoken to their lawyers. She told them the same story that Derek had told the police, that it was an accident during unsafe play by the children. The insurance company lawyer, William Hayes, was experienced in these types of cases. Mrs. Thornton, are you absolutely sure that's what happened? Head injuries in children can result in very large settlements. I'm completely sure, Margaret lied. Our employee was doing his job trying to keep children safe. It was an unfortunate accident. Good, William said. We'll send our investigator to interview everyone and document the scene. The key is to make sure everyone tells the same story. After Margaret hung up the phone, she called Derek into her office again. Derek, the insurance investigator will be here this afternoon. You need to tell him exactly what you told the police. Don't change anything and don't add any details. Derek nodded, but he looked sick. What about Mrs. Rodriguez? She keeps saying I hit Sarah on purpose. Margaret had already thought about this. Mrs. Rodriguez is not from this country originally. Her English is not perfect and she was very upset when it happened. We'll explain that she misunderstood what she saw. This was not true. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived in America for 20 years and her English was excellent. But Margaret was willing to say anything to protect her story. At the hospital, Mrs. Rodriguez was sitting beside Sarah's bed. The little girl was still unconscious with bandages around her head and tubes in her arms. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring her heart rate and breathing. Mrs. Rodriguez held Sarah's small hand and talked to her softly. Sarah, honey, you need to wake up. Everyone is worried about you. Your father is going to come home soon. Dr. Park came into the room to check on Sarah. How is she doing? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Her vital signs are stable, Dr. Park said. But we're still very concerned about the swelling in her brain. The next 24 hours are critical. Have you been able to reach her father? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. We've contacted the Army, but they say Captain Mitchell is on a classified mission. They're trying to get word to him, but it may take some time. Mrs. Rodriguez felt so helpless. This little girl needed her father, but he was somewhere far away, serving his country, not knowing that his daughter was fighting for her life. Later that morning, Detective Sarah Williams arrived at the hospital. She was assigned to investigate the incident because any injury to a child had to be looked into carefully. Detective Williams had been a police officer for 12 years and had investigated many cases involving injured children. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to ask you some questions about what happened yesterday, Detective Williams said as they sat in a quiet room near the hospital cafeteria. Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez said. I want to help Sarah in any way I can. Tell me exactly what you saw. Mrs. Rodriguez took a deep breath and told the detective everything she remembered. She described how Derek had arrived angry and yelling. She explained how he had tried to take the bat away from Sarah, and she clearly stated that she saw Derek hit Sarah in the head with the bat. Detective Williams wrote everything down carefully. You're absolutely certain that Mr. Holbrook struck the child with the bat? Yes, I'm completely sure, Mrs. Rodriguez said. It was not an accident. He was angry and he hit her. Detective Williams found this very interesting. The story Mrs. Rodriguez was telling was completely different from what Derek Holbrook had reported. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Holbrook says that Sarah was injured accidentally during unsafe play. He says you may have been confused by the excitement of the moment. Mrs. Rodriguez became upset. I was not confused. I saw exactly what happened. That man hurt Sarah on purpose. Detective Williams made a note to investigate this case much more carefully. When the victim's story and the witness's story were completely different, it usually meant someone was lying. After leaving the hospital, Detective Williams drove to Willowbrook Park. She wanted to examine the scene and look for any physical evidence. At the park, she met with Officer Johnson, who had taken the original report. Mike, what did you think about this case? She asked. Officer Johnson shrugged. The HOA guy seemed nervous and his story didn't quite match what the kids were saying. But kids can get confused about what they saw. Detective Williams looked around the park. She noticed the small building where the HOA kept equipment and saw the security cameras. Are there cameras that would have recorded the incident? She asked. I don't know, Officer Johnson said. I didn't check yesterday because the HOA guy said it was clearly an accident. Detective Williams walked over to the building and knocked on the door. A maintenance worker named Bob Chen opened it. I'm Detective Williams. I'm investigating the incident that happened here yesterday. Do your security cameras record what happens in the park? Bob looked confused. They're supposed to, but the system has been having problems lately. Yesterday's recordings are completely missing. Missing? What do you mean? The whole day is gone from the system. Mrs. Thornton, the HOA president, said the system has been malfunctioning. She's going to call the repair company. Detective Williams felt suspicious. It seemed very convenient that the security recordings were missing from the exact day when a serious incident occurred. When did Mrs. Thornton discover that the recordings were missing? Bob thought about this. She called me this morning to tell me about it. She said she checked the system last night after she heard about the accident. This made Detective Williams even more suspicious. Why would the HOA president check the security cameras after an accident, unless she suspected there might be more to the story? Can I see the camera system? Detective Williams asked. Bob showed her the equipment. Detective Williams was not an expert with computers, but she knew that video recordings didn't usually just disappear by themselves. She made a note to have the police computer expert examine the system. Meanwhile, the insurance investigator, Jim Peterson, had arrived at the HOA office. Jim had been investigating insurance claims for 15 years and was very good at spotting fraud. Margaret and Derek met with Jim and repeated their story about the accident during unsafe play. But Jim noticed several things that bothered him. First, Derek seemed very nervous and kept changing small details in his story. Second, Margaret seemed to know too much about what had happened for someone who had not been there. Mr. Holbrook, Jim said, you said the children were playing unsafely. Can you be more specific about what they were doing wrong? Derek hesitated. He had not prepared for detailed questions. Well, they were swinging the bat too hard and not watching where other kids were standing. But the injury was to the girl's head, and you said she was the one holding the bat. How did she hit herself in the head? Derek started sweating. She was swinging wildly and lost control of the bat. Jim made notes, but the story did not make sense. A girl hitting herself in the head hard enough to fracture her skull would be almost impossible. Were there any witnesses besides Mrs. Rodriguez? Just the other children, Margaret answered quickly. But they were all very upset and confused. Jim decided he needed to interview the children separately, away from any adults who might influence their answers. That afternoon, Jim visited the homes of the children who had been at the park. Tommy's mother, Linda Peterson, let Jim interview Tommy in their living room. Tommy, can you tell me what happened at the park yesterday? Jim asked gently. Tommy was only 8 years old, but he remembered clearly what he had seen. The mean man in the uniform came and yelled at us. Sarah was holding the bat and he tried to take it. When Sarah wouldn't let go, he got really mad and hit her with the bat. Captain James Mitchell was deep in the mountains of Eastern Europe when the emergency message reached him. He was leading a special mission with 5 other soldiers when his radio crackled with an urgent communication from base command. Captain Mitchell, you need to return to base immediately. Family emergency. Your daughter has been seriously injured. James felt his heart stop. Sarah was the most important thing in his world. After his wife died in a car accident 3 years ago, Sarah became everything to him. He had not wanted to leave her for this mission, but his duty to his country required it. How badly is she hurt? James asked into the radio. Unknown at this time, Captain. Emergency leave has been approved. Transport will pick you up at the extraction point in 2 hours. James looked at his team. Sergeant Mike Torres, who had served with James for 6 years, could see the fear in his captain's eyes. Go, sir, Torres said. We can finish the mission. Your little girl needs you. James had trained himself to stay calm in dangerous situations, but this was different. This was his daughter. His hands shook as he packed his equipment. The helicopter ride back to base took 4 hours. James spent every minute thinking about Sarah and wondering what had happened to her. Was she in a car accident? Did she fall? Was she sick? The not knowing was torture. At the base, Colonel Patricia Hayes was waiting for him. Colonel Hayes had been James's commanding officer for 3 years and knew how much Sarah meant to him. James, I have a transport plane ready to take you home, she said. Your daughter is in the hospital with a serious head injury. Head injury? What happened? Colonel Hayes handed him a folder with the basic information she had received. According to the initial reports, she was injured during an incident at a park near your home. The details are unclear, but she's unconscious and needs surgery. James read the report quickly. It mentioned an HOA enforcement officer named Derek Holbrook and an accident during children's play, but the report was very basic and did not give him the details he needed. Colonel, I need to know exactly what happened to my daughter. The information we have is limited, Colonel Hayes said. But James, you know I will support any investigation you need to do. That little girl is like family to all of us here. This was true. James had been stationed at this base for 4 years, and his fellow soldiers had watched Sarah grow up through video calls and visits. She was everyone's favorite little girl, always smiling and asking the soldiers to tell her stories about their adventures. The flight home took 18 hours with 2 stops for fuel. James sat in the military transport plane, unable to sleep or eat. He kept looking at a photo of Sarah on his phone. It was taken just before he left for his mission. She was wearing her favorite pink dress and had a big smile on her face. James had been trained as a military investigator before he became a special forces officer. His job was to find the truth in complicated situations. As he flew home, his investigator instincts started working. The basic report about Sarah's injury did not make sense to him. How does a child get a skull fracture from playing baseball? And why was an HOA enforcement officer involved in children playing at a park? James had dealt with many HOAs when he was stationed at different bases. Most HOA enforcement officers were not trained law enforcement. They usually just told people to cut their grass or move their cars. Why would one be taking equipment away from children? When the plane landed, James was met by his father-in-law, Robert Chen, who had driven from 2 states away when he heard about Sarah's injury. How is she? James asked as they drove to the hospital. She's been unconscious for 2 days. Robert said with tears in his eyes. The doctors say her condition is stable, but they don't know when she'll wake up. Tell me exactly what happened. Robert told James everything that Mrs. Rodriguez had told him. Mrs. Rodriguez had been taking care of Sarah for 2 years and was like family to them. Mrs. Rodriguez says the HOA man hit Sarah with a baseball bat on purpose, Robert said. But the police report says it was an accident. This made James even more suspicious. Mrs. Rodriguez was one of the most honest people he knew. If she said someone hit Sarah on purpose, then that was probably what happened. At the hospital, James ran to Sarah's room. When he saw his little girl lying unconscious with bandages around her head and tubes in her arms, he felt anger like he had never felt before. Mrs. Rodriguez was sitting beside Sarah's bed. When she saw James, she started crying. "Captain Mitchell, I'm so sorry. I should have protected her better." James hugged Mrs. Rodriguez. "This is not your fault. Tell me everything that happened." Mrs. Rodriguez told James the same story she had told everyone else. She described Derek's anger, his attempt to take the bat, and how he had hit Sarah when she wouldn't let go. "You're absolutely certain he hit her on purpose?" James asked. "Yes, Captain. There is no doubt in my mind. He was very angry and he swung that bat at her head deliberately." James sat beside Sarah's bed and held her small hand. "Sarah, Daddy's here now. I'm going to find out what happened to you and make sure the person who hurt you pays for it." Dr. Park came into the room to update James on Sarah's condition. "Captain Mitchell, your daughter has a serious skull fracture and brain swelling. We performed surgery to relieve the pressure, but we're still very concerned." "What are her chances of full recovery?" Dr. Park was honest with him. "Head injuries in children are unpredictable. She could wake up tomorrow and be completely fine, or she could have permanent problems with memory, speech, or movement. We just have to wait and see." James felt his anger growing. Someone had done this to his innocent little girl, and now she might never be the same. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, could this injury have been caused by a baseball bat hitting her in the head?" Dr. Park looked at James carefully. She could tell he was asking for a specific reason. "Yes, the injury pattern is consistent with being struck by a blunt object like a baseball bat. The force would have had to be significant to cause this much damage." This confirmed what James suspected. Sarah's injury was not from falling or from an accident during play. Someone had hit her hard with a bat. James left the hospital and drove to the Willowbrook Park to examine the scene himself. His military training had taught him to always examine physical evidence personally. At the park, James walked around and tried to understand exactly what had happened. He noticed the security cameras and wondered if they had recorded the incident. James knocked on the door of the small building where the HOA kept equipment. The same maintenance worker, Bob Chen, opened the door. "Are you the father of the little girl who got hurt?" Bob asked when he saw James's military uniform. "Yes, I'm Captain Mitchell. I understand there are security cameras that watch this park." Bob looked uncomfortable. "Well, yes, but the recordings from that day are missing. The system malfunctioned." James's investigator instincts told him this was suspicious. "When did you discover the recordings were missing?" "Mrs. Thornton, the HOA president, told me about it the morning after the accident. She said she had checked the system and found the malfunction." James found this very strange. Why would the HOA president check security cameras after an accident, unless she suspected there was more to the story? "Can I see the camera system?" Bob showed James the equipment. James had worked with similar systems during his military service. He could see that the recordings had been manually deleted, not lost due to a malfunction. "Bob, this system didn't malfunction. Someone deliberately erased the recordings." Bob looked shocked. "Are you sure?" "I'm absolutely sure. Someone deleted the video from that day on purpose." James now knew that there was a cover-up happening. Someone had deliberately destroyed evidence of what happened to Sarah. James drove to the HOA office to confront Margaret Thornton directly. When he walked into the office in his military uniform, Margaret immediately looked nervous. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm Captain Mitchell, Sarah's father." "Oh, Captain Mitchell. I'm so sorry about your daughter's accident. It was a terrible tragedy." "It wasn't an accident," James said firmly. "Your employee assaulted my daughter and now you're trying to cover it up." Margaret tried to look surprised. "Captain, I think you've been given wrong information. Mr. Holbrook was trying to keep the children safe when the accident happened." "Where is Mr. Holbrook now?" "He's taken some time off while the investigation is ongoing. He's very upset about what happened." James could tell that Margaret was lying. Her story sounded rehearsed, and she would not look him in the eyes. Mrs. Thornton, I know the security recordings were deliberately erased. That's destruction of evidence, which is a felony. Margaret's face went pale. The camera system malfunctioned. We've had problems with it before. I examined the system myself. I'm trained in digital forensics. The recordings were manually deleted, not lost to a malfunction. Margaret realized she was dealing with someone much more dangerous than she had expected. This was not just an upset parent. This was a trained military investigator who knew how to uncover the truth. Captain Mitchell, I think there may be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, James said. Your employee assaulted my 8-year-old daughter with a baseball bat, and you're helping him cover it up. But you made one big mistake, and what mistake? The next morning, James Mitchell sat in his hotel room with files spread across the bed. He had spent all night reading police reports, medical records, and insurance documents. His military training had taught him to be thorough and systematic when investigating a case. James had also called in some favors. His friend Marcus Williams worked for the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit. Marcus agreed to help James recover the deleted security camera footage. James, I'm sorry about Sarah, Marcus said when he arrived at the hotel. The whole team wants to help catch whoever did this to her. Marcus was one of the best computer experts in the FBI. If anyone could recover the deleted video, it was him. The local police say the video was lost due to a system malfunction, James explained. But when I examined the equipment, I could tell someone deleted it on purpose. Don't worry, Marcus said. People think that deleting files makes them disappear forever, but that's not usually true. Even when files are deleted, they often leave traces that we can recover. While Marcus worked on the computer system at the park, James decided to interview the children who had witnessed Sarah's assault. He knew that children often made the best witnesses because they had not learned to lie like adults. James's first stop was Tommy's house. Tommy's mother, Linda Peterson, was happy to let James speak with her son. Tommy, I'm Sarah's daddy, James said as they sat in the living room. Can you tell me what happened when Sarah got hurt? Tommy was only 8 years old, but he remembered everything clearly. The mean man in the uniform came to the park and yelled at us. He was really angry. What did he yell about? He said we were too loud and that we couldn't use our baseball bat. Sarah was holding the bat and he tried to take it away from her. Then what happened? Tommy looked sad. Sarah didn't want to give him the bat because it belonged to my big brother. She was scared and she held on tight. The man got really mad and grabbed the bat. Did you see him hit Sarah? Yes, Tommy said without hesitation. He swung the bat and hit her right in the head. Sarah fell down and didn't move. There was blood everywhere. James felt his anger growing, but he stayed calm for Tommy's sake. Tommy, are you absolutely sure the man hit Sarah on purpose? Yes, he was really angry and he wanted to hurt her. All the kids saw it happen. James thanked Tommy and his mother, then visited 3 more children who had been at the park. All of them told exactly the same story. Derek Holbrook had deliberately hit Sarah in the head with a baseball bat because he was angry that she wouldn't let go of it. Meanwhile, Marcus was having success with the security camera system. James, you were right. The video files were manually deleted, but I can see traces of them in the system's memory. Can you recover the actual video? I'm working on it. It's going to take some time, but I think I can get at least part of it back. While Marcus continued working, James decided to investigate Derek Holbrook's background. He used his military contacts to run a complete check on Derek's history. What James found shocked him. Derek had applied to be a police officer in 3 different cities, but was rejected each time for failing psychological evaluations. The evaluations showed that Derek had anger management problems and was not suitable for law enforcement work. James also discovered that Derek had been fired from 2 previous jobs for aggressive behavior toward customers. One employer had written in Derek's file that he became hostile and threatening when challenged by anyone. This information proved that the HOA had hired someone who was known to be aggressive and unsuitable for any kind of enforcement work. It showed that Derek's assault on Sarah was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of violent behavior. James called Detective Sarah Williams, who was officially investigating Sarah's case for the local police department. Detective Williams, I'm Captain Mitchell, Sarah's father. I have some important information about your investigation. Captain Mitchell, I was hoping to hear from you. I have some concerns about this case myself. They met at a coffee shop near the hospital. Detective Williams had been a police officer for 12 years and had investigated many cases involving injured children. She knew when something was not right. "Captain, I've interviewed everyone involved in this case and the stories don't match up," Detective Williams said. "The HOA employee says it was an accident, but Mrs. Rodriguez and all the children say he hit your daughter deliberately." "I've interviewed the children myself," James said. "They all tell the same story. Derek Holbrook assaulted Sarah because he was angry that she wouldn't give him the baseball bat." James shared Derek's background check information with Detective Williams. She was surprised by what she read. "This man has a clear history of violence and was rejected by multiple police departments," she said. "Why would the HOA hire someone like this?" "That's what I intend to find out," James replied. Detective Williams also told James about her conversation with the insurance investigator, Jim Peterson. "Mr. Peterson is convinced that this was a deliberate assault and that there's a cover-up happening. He's refusing to pay the insurance claim until he gets more information." This was good news for James. Having the insurance investigator on his side would put more pressure on the HOA to tell the truth. James decided his next step was to confront Derek Holbrook directly. He had learned from his military experience that sometimes the best way to get the truth was to surprise the guilty person with evidence they didn't know existed. James found Derek's address in the phone book and drove to his apartment. Derek lived in a rundown complex on the other side of town. When Derek opened the door and saw James in his military uniform, his face went white. "Mr. Holbrook, I'm Captain Mitchell, Sarah's father. We need to talk." Derek tried to close the door, but James put his foot in the way. "I don't have to talk to you," Derek said nervously. "You're right, you don't have to talk to me," James said calmly. "But I already know the truth about what you did to my daughter. I've interviewed all the witnesses and I'm recovering the security camera footage you thought you destroyed." Derek's hands started shaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Derek, I know you have a history of violence. I know you were rejected by 3 police departments for psychological problems. And I know you deliberately hit my 8-year-old daughter in the head with a baseball bat." Derek looked around nervously as if he wanted to run away. "It was an accident. I was just trying to do my job." "Your job was to assault children with baseball bats?" "No, I was trying to take the bat away because it was dangerous." Derek realized he was saying too much. James could see that Derek was cracking under pressure. "Derek, here's what's going to happen," James said in a calm but firm voice. "You're going to be arrested and charged with assault. The HOA is going to be sued for millions of dollars, and everyone is going to know that you attacked a defenseless child. But it was an accident." "No, it wasn't. I have 4 child witnesses who saw you hit Sarah deliberately. I have Mrs. Rodriguez who saw the whole thing. And soon I'll have video evidence showing exactly what you did." Derek started crying. "I didn't mean to hurt her so badly. I just got angry when she wouldn't let go of the bat." This was exactly what James had been waiting for. A confession. "So you admit you hit her on purpose?" Derek realized what he had just said. I was just... It was still an accident, but it was too late. Derek had already admitted that he hit Sarah because he was angry, which proved it was not an accident. James left Derek's apartment and immediately called Detective Williams to report Derek's confession. Now they had witness testimony, physical evidence, and a confession from the perpetrator. The next piece of the puzzle was proving that Margaret Thornton had helped cover up the crime. James decided to investigate the HOA's finances and insurance policies. Using his military access to financial databases, James discovered something very interesting. The HOA had recently increased their liability insurance coverage to $10 million. The policy had been changed just 1 month before Sarah's assault. This suggested that the HOA knew Derek was dangerous and were preparing for the possibility that he might hurt someone. It proved that they had been negligent in hiring and supervising him. James also found records showing that Margaret Thornton had received several complaints about Derek's aggressive behavior from other residents. She had ignored all of these complaints and had never disciplined Derek or provided him with additional training. Meanwhile, Marcus called with exciting news. "James, I was able to recover most of the security camera footage. You need to see this." James rushed to the park where Marcus was working on his laptop. "I recovered about 3 minutes of video showing the entire incident," Marcus said. The video was crystal clear. It showed Derek arriving at the park in his HOA truck. It showed him yelling at the children and demanding that Sarah give him the bat. It showed Sarah holding onto the bat because she was scared. and it clearly showed Derek grabbing the bat and swinging it directly at Sarah's head. "This video proves everything," James said. "Derek assaulted Sarah and it was completely deliberate." "There's more," Marcus said. "I also recovered data showing when the video was deleted. It was erased the same evening as the assault, just 2 hours after Margaret Thornton visited the camera system." With the recovered video evidence and Derek's partial confession, James decided to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. His military training had taught him that corruption rarely happened in isolation. Where there was one crime, there were usually others. James spent the next day at the county courthouse, examining public records related to the Willowbrook HOA. What he found was shocking. The HOA had been sued 12 times in the past 3 years for various violations of residents' rights. Most of these cases had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements, which meant the public never learned about the HOA's illegal activities. More disturbing was the discovery that Derek Holbrook was not the only problematic employee the HOA had hired. James found records showing that 2 other enforcement officers had been fired after complaints of harassment and intimidation. One former employee, Maria Santos, had been fired after she was caught threatening to have residents' cars towed if they didn't pay fines for violations that didn't exist. Another employee, Robert Kim, had been terminated after he was accused of entering residents' homes without permission while they were at work. James realized that the Willowbrook HOA was not just a homeowners association. It was a corrupt organization that had been systematically abusing its residents for years. James decided to interview some of the residents who had filed complaints against the HOA. His first visit was to an elderly man named Frank Wilson, who lived 3 streets away from the park. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Captain Mitchell. My daughter was the little girl who was injured at the park last week." Frank's face became angry. "Captain, I am so sorry about your daughter. That HOA has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years." Frank invited James into his home and told him a disturbing story. 6 months ago, Derek Holbrook came to my house and demanded that I remove my bird feeder because it was attracting pests. When I refused, he threatened to fine me $500 a day until I complied. "Did you report this to anyone?" "I tried to file a complaint with the HOA board, but Margaret Thornton said that Derek was just doing his job. She said if I didn't like the rules, I could move somewhere else." Frank showed James a folder full of documents related to his conflicts with the HOA. "Captain, they've been using fear and intimidation to control everyone in this neighborhood. Derek Holbrook was just the worst of them." James visited 6 more residents and heard similar stories. The HOA had been abusing its power for years, and Margaret Thornton had been protecting employees who broke the law and violated residents' rights. But James's most shocking discovery came when he interviewed a former HOA board member named Patricia Lee. Patricia had resigned from the board 6 months earlier, after clashing with Margaret Thornton. "Captain Mitchell, I tried to warn the other board members about Derek Holbrook," Patricia said. "I told them he was dangerous and shouldn't be allowed to interact with residents." "What did Margaret Thornton say?" "She said Derek was effective at enforcing rules and that the residents needed to learn to respect authority. When I pushed for Derek to be fired, Margaret accused me of being soft and said I didn't understand how to run a proper HOA." Patricia showed James copies of emails she had saved from her time on the board. In one email, Margaret had written, "Derek gets results. Sometimes you have to be firm with people to make them follow the rules." In another email, Margaret had responded to a complaint about Derek's aggressive behavior by writing, "The residents need to understand that we have the authority to enforce compliance. If they don't like our methods, they can sell their homes and move somewhere else." These emails proved that Margaret Thornton knew Derek was aggressive and potentially dangerous, but she had kept him employed because his intimidation tactics were effective at controlling residents. "Patricia, why didn't you report this to the authorities?" "I tried," Patricia said sadly, "but the police told me that HOA disputes were civil matters, not criminal ones. They said unless Derek actually hurt someone, there was nothing they could do." James realized that Derek's assault on Sarah was not an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of years of escalating aggression that had been ignored and even encouraged by Margaret Thornton. The next day, James received a call from Marcus, his FBI friend who had recovered the security camera footage. "James, I found something else in the HOA's computer system that you need to see." They met at the HOA office, which was closed for the day. Marcus had obtained a warrant to examine all of the HOA's electronic records. "I've been going through their emails and financial records," Marcus said. "The corruption goes much deeper than just Derek Holbrook." Marcus showed James evidence that Margaret Thornton had been embezzling money from the HOA's budget for years. She had been creating fake invoices for maintenance work that was never performed, and then keeping the money for herself. She's stolen over $200,000 from the homeowners over the past 4 years, Marcus explained. But the financial fraud was not the worst of what Marcus had discovered. "James, I also found evidence that Margaret knew Derek had a history of violence against children." Marcus showed James an email that Margaret had received from Derek's previous employer, warning her that Derek had been fired after an incident involving his aggressive behavior toward a child at a community pool. "She hired him anyway," Marcus said, "even after being warned that he was dangerous around children." This was the smoking gun that James had been looking for. Margaret Thornton had knowingly hired a man who was dangerous to children, and then she had covered up his assault on Sarah. Meanwhile, Detective Williams had been building her own case against Derek and Margaret. She had obtained search warrants for both of their homes and had found additional evidence of their crimes. At Derek's apartment, she found a collection of complaints and incident reports from residents that Derek had never turned into the HOA board. He had been hiding evidence of his own misconduct to avoid being disciplined. At Margaret's home, Detective Williams found documents showing that Margaret had been planning to fire Derek just 2 days before he assaulted Sarah. She had finally realized that Derek was too dangerous to keep employed, but her decision came too late to protect Sarah. "This proves that Margaret knew Derek was out of control," Detective Williams told James. "She was going to fire him because she knew he was going to hurt someone." James also learned from Detective Williams that the insurance company had started their own investigation into the HOA's operations. The insurance investigator, Jim Peterson, had discovered a pattern of complaints and lawsuits that suggested the HOA was a high-risk client. "The insurance company is considering canceling their policy entirely," Detective Williams said. "If that happens, the HOA won't be able to operate legally." All of this evidence painted a clear picture of a corrupt organization that had been abusing residents for years, led by a president who cared more about power and money than about the safety of the people she was supposed to serve. But James's investigation took an even more serious turn when he discovered that Derek Holbrook had been impersonating a police officer while examining Derek's uniform and equipment. James noticed that Derek's badge and uniform were almost identical to those used by real police officers. Derek had been deliberately trying to make residents think he was a real cop with legal authority to enforce laws. Impersonating a police officer was a federal crime that could result in years in prison. This discovery meant that Derek could face federal charges in addition to the state charges for assaulting Sarah. James called the FBI's local office and reported his findings. Agent Lisa Park was assigned to investigate the federal crimes. "Captain Mitchell, if Mr. Holbrook was impersonating a federal law enforcement officer, this becomes a very serious federal case," Agent Park said. James showed Agent Park photos of Derek's uniform and badge. He was clearly trying to make people think he was a real police officer. He used this fake authority to intimidate residents and to justify his aggressive behavior. Agent Park agreed to add federal charges to Derek's case. This meant that Derek could face up to 10 years in federal prison for impersonating an officer, in addition to whatever state charges he faced for assaulting Sarah. The investigation had now expanded far beyond Sarah's assault. Derek and Margaret were facing multiple state and federal charges, and the entire HOA was under investigation for fraud and corruption. James felt satisfied that he had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy, but he was also angry that it had taken his daughter's injury to expose these crimes. How many other residents had been abused and intimidated over the years, while authorities ignored their complaints? That evening, James visited Sarah in the hospital. She was still unconscious, but the doctors said her brain swelling was going down, and they were optimistic about her recovery. "Sarah, Daddy found out that the people who hurt you have been hurting lots of other people too," James said as he held her hand. "But now everyone knows the truth and they're going to be punished for everything they've done." James had uncovered a conspiracy that went far beyond one man's assault on his daughter. He had exposed years of corruption, fraud, and abuse by people who were supposed to be serving their community. Word about Sarah's assault and the subsequent investigation had spread throughout Captain Mitchell's military unit. When soldiers learned that their beloved little Sarah, who had brightened their video calls with her cheerful waves and questions about their adventures, had been brutally attacked, and that there was a cover-up, they began arriving in town. Sergeant Mike Torres was the first to arrive. He had served with James for 6 years and considered Sarah like his own niece. When he walked into the hospital wearing his dress uniform, nurses and visitors stopped to stare. "Sir, how's our little soldier?" Torres asked James as they stood outside Sarah's room. "She's stable but still unconscious," James replied. "The doctors say the next few days are critical." Torres looked through the window at Sarah, who looked so small and fragile with all the medical equipment around her. His jaw tightened with anger. "Sir, the whole unit is ready to help. Master Sergeant Johnson is driving down from the base, and Corporal Williams is flying in from his leave." This was not just about one soldier's family crisis. This was about an attack on their military family. Colonel Patricia Hayes had also taken a personal interest in the case. When she learned the full extent of the corruption and cover-up, she contacted the Pentagon's Inspector General's office. This case involves the assault of a service member's child and subsequent obstruction of justice, Colonel Hayes reported. The perpetrators used fake law enforcement credentials and destroyed evidence. This has implications for military families everywhere. The Pentagon's involvement brought federal resources that local authorities could never access. Military investigators, FBI agents, and federal prosecutors all began working together on the case. Meanwhile, Derek Holbrook was becoming increasingly desperate. He knew that his lies were falling apart and that serious federal charges were coming. Derek had been hiding in his apartment, afraid to go outside because he knew that Sarah's father was a trained Special Forces soldier. Margaret Thornton was also panicking. She had received a call from the HOA's insurance company, informing her that their policy was being canceled immediately due to the fraud and criminal activity. "Mrs. Thornton, our investigation has revealed systematic fraud, embezzlement, and cover-up of violent crimes," the insurance company representative told her. "We cannot continue to provide coverage for your organization." Without insurance, the HOA could not legally operate. Margaret realized that her career and her freedom were both in jeopardy. Margaret decided to try to save herself by blaming everything on Derek. She called Detective Williams and requested a meeting. "Detective, I've been thinking about the incident with the little girl, and I believe Derek may have misled me about what really happened," Margaret said. Detective Williams was not surprised by Margaret's attempt to shift blame. "Mrs. Thornton, we have evidence that you personally deleted the security camera footage. That's destruction of evidence, which is a felony. I was just trying to protect the HOA from liability. Derek told me it was an accident. Mrs. Thornton, we recovered the video. We know exactly what Derek did to Sarah Mitchell, and we know you helped cover it up." Margaret realized that her attempt to blame Derek had failed. The evidence against her was overwhelming. At the same time, more soldiers were arriving in town. The sight of multiple military personnel in uniform walking through the hospital and around the courthouse was making everyone take notice of Sarah's case. Master Sergeant Johnson arrived with Staff Sergeant Brown and Corporal Williams. They immediately went to the hospital to check on Sarah and support James. "Captain, we've been authorized to provide any assistance you need," Master Sergeant Johnson reported. "The Colonel wants you to know that all of our resources are at your disposal." The presence of so many military personnel was having an unexpected effect on the local community. Residents who had been afraid to speak out against the HOA's abuse began coming forward with their stories. Frank Wilson, the elderly man who had been threatened over his bird feeder, organized a meeting of residents who had been victimized by the HOA. "Everyone in this neighborhood has been living in fear of these people," Frank announced to the group of 30 residents who attended. "But now that we see what they did to that little soldier's daughter, we have to speak up." One by one, residents shared their stories of intimidation, harassment, and illegal fines imposed by Derek and Margaret. Many had been too afraid to complain before, but seeing the military support for Sarah's family gave them courage. The stories painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for years. Derek had threatened elderly residents, harassed young families, and used his fake police authority to intimidate anyone who questioned the HOA's increasingly extreme rules. Detective Williams collected all of these statements and added them to her growing case file. Each news story provided additional evidence of Derek and Margaret's criminal conspiracy. Meanwhile, Agent Lisa Park from the FBI had completed her investigation into Derek's impersonation of a police officer. Her findings were damning. Derek Holbrook obtained his uniform and badge from a supplier that specializes in law enforcement equipment. Agent Park reported to James and Detective Williams. He specifically requested items that would make him look like a real police officer. This was clearly intentional deception. Agent Park had also discovered that Derek had been using his fake police credentials in other situations outside of his HOA duties. We found evidence that he used his fake badge to get discounts at restaurants and to intimidate people in parking lot disputes. This shows a pattern of criminal impersonation that goes well beyond his HOA work. The federal charges against Derek were now substantial. In addition to impersonating an officer, he faced charges for assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Margaret's situation was equally serious. The FBI had found evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and destruction of evidence. Her attempts to blame Derek had actually made her situation worse by proving that she knew about his crimes, but had tried to cover them up. 3 days after the soldiers began arriving in town, something wonderful happened. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. James was sitting beside her bed when she woke up. "Daddy?" she whispered weakly. James felt tears of relief running down his face. "I'm here, sweetheart. Daddy's here." Dr. Park was called immediately to examine Sarah. After a thorough check, she had good news. Sarah appears to have full cognitive function. She remembers who she is, she recognizes her father, and her speech is clear. This is the best possible outcome given the severity of her injury. The news of Sarah's awakening spread quickly through the hospital and to the soldiers who had come to support James. "Master." Sergeant Johnson called Colonel Hayes immediately. "Colonel, little Sarah is awake and she's going to be okay." "That's the best news I've heard all week," Colonel Hayes replied. "Make sure Captain Mitchell knows that his entire military family is celebrating with him." But Sarah's recovery did not change the criminal cases against Derek and Margaret. If anything, it strengthened them because Sarah would now be able to testify about what Derek had done to her. When Detective Williams gently interviewed Sarah about the incident, the 8-year-old girl's testimony was clear and consistent with all the other evidence. "The mean man in the uniform was really angry," Sarah told Detective Williams. "He tried to take our baseball bat, and when I wouldn't let go, he hit me in the head with it. It hurt really bad." Sarah's testimony, combined with the recovered video evidence, Derek's partial confession, and the witness statements from the other children, created an overwhelming case against Derek. Meanwhile, the story of Sarah's assault and the military response had begun attracting national media attention. News reporters from major television networks arrived in town to cover the story of the little girl who was assaulted by a fake cop and how her special forces father had uncovered a conspiracy. The media attention put even more pressure on local prosecutors to handle the case properly. District Attorney Michael Chen announced that his office would seek the maximum penalties for all charges against Derek and Margaret. The assault of this child and the subsequent cover-up represent serious crimes that demand serious consequences, District Attorney Chen said at a press conference. "We will use every resource available to ensure justice is served." The media coverage also brought the HOA's abuse to national attention. Other HOA victims from around the country began contacting news stations to share similar stories of corruption and abuse. Margaret Thornton, seeing the national attention and federal involvement, made one last desperate attempt to avoid prosecution. She contacted District Attorney Chen's office and offered to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced charges. "Mrs. Thornton is willing to provide complete testimony about Derek Holbrook's actions and the HOA's operations," her lawyer told the prosecutor. But District Attorney Chen was not interested in deals. Mrs. Thornton destroyed evidence and participated in a conspiracy to cover up the assault of a child. She will face the full consequences of her actions. Derek, meanwhile, had stopped communicating with anyone. His lawyer had advised him that his best option was to plead guilty and hope for mercy from the court. The federal prosecutors were also building their case. 2 weeks after Sarah woke up, she was finally strong enough to leave the hospital. James carried her to the car while a group of his fellow soldiers watched and applauded. Sarah waved weakly at them, still wearing a small bandage on her head but smiling for the first time since the assault. "Daddy, why are all your soldier friends here?" Sarah asked as James buckled her seatbelt. "They're here because they love you, sweetheart, and they wanted to make sure the people who hurt you got in trouble for it." The criminal cases against Derek Holbrook and Margaret Thornton were moving quickly through the court system. The overwhelming evidence that James had gathered made it impossible for either of them to deny their crimes. Derek's lawyer had advised him to plead guilty to all charges in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. Derek was facing state charges for assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, and filing false police reports. He also faced federal charges for impersonating a police officer, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Margaret was facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The evidence against her was so strong that her lawyer also recommended pleading guilty. But before the cases went to court, something unexpected happened that would change everything. An investigative reporter named Jennifer Walsh from a major television network had been following the story since it broke. Her research uncovered something shocking that even James's thorough investigation had missed. Jennifer discovered that Derek Holbrook and Margaret Thornton were part of a larger network of corrupt HOA officials operating in multiple states. The scheme involved hiring aggressive enforcement officers who would intimidate residents into paying excessive fines, with part of the money being kicked back to a company owned by Margaret's brother. "This isn't just about one HOA," Jennifer reported on the evening news. "This is about a criminal network that has been operating in 12 states, stealing money from homeowners and violating civil rights." The FBI immediately expanded their investigation to include HOAs in other states. What they found was a conspiracy involving over 50 HOA officials and millions of dollars in stolen money. Derek and Margaret suddenly became key witnesses in a much larger federal case. Federal prosecutors offered them reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation in exposing the entire network. Derek, facing the possibility of 20 years in prison, agreed to cooperate fully. He provided detailed information about how the scam worked and identified other participants in different states. Margaret also agreed to cooperate, but her cooperation would not save her from significant prison time. She had been one of the organizers of the scheme and had personally stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from homeowners. Meanwhile, the residents of Willowbrook were dealing with the aftermath of their HOA's collapse. With Margaret gone and the organization under federal investigation, there was no one to manage the neighborhood's common areas or enforce legitimate rules. Frank Wilson, the elderly man who had organized the resistance against the HOA's abuse, called a meeting of all residents. "We need to decide what kind of community we want to have," Frank announced to the crowd of nearly 200 residents who attended. "We can form a new HOA with proper oversight, or we can dissolve the association entirely and let the county handle everything." The residents voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the HOA completely. They had seen what happened when HOA officials were given too much power, and they never wanted to experience that kind of abuse again. "We're going back to being a regular neighborhood where neighbors help each other instead of threatening each other," Frank declared to cheers from the crowd. The decision to dissolve the HOA meant that residents would no longer have to pay monthly fees or follow arbitrary rules about their property. They could paint their houses any color they wanted, park their cars wherever they chose, and let their children play freely in the parks. For the first time in years, Willowbrook felt like a real community instead of a place where people lived in fear of their own neighbors. James was invited to speak at the final HOA dissolution meeting. He stood before his neighbors with Sarah sitting in the front row, wearing a pink dress and smiling. 2 months ago, "My daughter was brutally assaulted by someone who was supposed to be serving this community," James said. "But from this tragedy, we've learned something important. We've learned that we must never give people power over us without holding them accountable for how they use that power." The residents gave James a standing ovation. Many had tears in their eyes as they thought about how close they had come to losing Sarah and how much she had suffered to expose the truth. James continued, "Sarah is recovering well and the doctors say she will be completely fine. But more importantly, no other child will ever be hurt by these people again." 6 months later, Derek Holbrook was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Even with his cooperation in the larger investigation, The judge decided that his assault on a child and his pattern of abusing residents required serious punishment. Mr. Holbrook, you used a position of trust to terrorize and intimidate innocent people, Judge Maria Santos said at his sentencing. Your assault on an 8-year-old girl represents the worst kind of abuse of power. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and will serve as a warning to others who might consider similar behavior. Derek's fake police uniform and badge were destroyed as part of his sentence. He would also be required to pay $500,000 in restitution to Sarah for her medical expenses and suffering. Margaret Thornton received 12 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. She was also ordered to pay back all the money she had stolen from the HOA, plus additional fines and penalties. Mrs. Thornton, you betrayed the trust of hundreds of families who relied on you to serve their community, Judge Santos said. Instead, you used your position to steal from them and to cover up violent crimes. Your sentence reflects the serious harm you caused to your entire community. The broader federal investigation resulted in the arrest of 43 HOA officials in 12 states. The total amount of money stolen was over $8 million, all of which was ordered to be returned to the homeowners who had been victimized. But the most important outcome was the creation of new federal laws regulating HOA operations. Congress passed the Sarah Mitchell Act, which required background checks for all HOA enforcement officers and created federal oversight for HOA operations. The new law also made it a federal crime for HOAs to use intimidation tactics against residents and required all HOA meetings and disciplinary actions to be recorded and made available to residents. James was invited to Washington, D.C. for the signing ceremony. Sarah, now fully recovered and back in school, accompanied him to meet the president. Sarah, because of your bravery and your father's determination to find the truth, millions of families will be protected from the kind of abuse you experienced, the president told her. Sarah, now 9 years old and confident again, smiled at the president. I'm glad other kids won't get hurt like I did. The ceremony was attended by dozens of soldiers from James's unit, who had traveled to Washington to support their fellow soldier and his brave daughter. A year after the assault, James decided to leave the military to spend more time with Sarah and to work full-time helping other families fight HOA abuse. He started a non-profit organization that provided free legal assistance to homeowners facing corrupt or abusive HOA officials. I learned that there are battles worth fighting right here at home, James explained to his commanding officer when he submitted his resignation. Sarah and I want to make sure no other family goes through what we experienced. Colonel Hayes accepted James's resignation with regret but understanding. Captain Mitchell, you've served your country with distinction both in uniform and as a civilian. Your work protecting families from HOA abuse is just as important as your military service. Sarah thrived in the years following her recovery. She became an honor student, learned to play piano, and joined her school's softball team, using the same bat that Derek had used to assault her, which had been returned to Tommy's family after the trial. But most importantly, Sarah grew up in a neighborhood where children could play freely without fear. The parks were full of laughter and games exactly as they should be. James often took Sarah to play baseball in the same park where she had been assaulted. The area had been renamed Sarah's Park by the residents, and a plaque had been installed honoring her courage and recovery. Daddy, do you think Derek is sorry for what he did? Sarah asked one day as they played catch. I think he is, sweetheart, but being sorry doesn't change what happened. The important thing is that he can never hurt anyone else. And other kids are safe because of what happened to me? That's right, Sarah, your courage helped protect millions of other children. Sarah smiled and threw the ball back to her father. She had learned at a young age that sometimes terrible things happen, but that good people will always fight to make things right. The Willowbrook neighborhood became a model for communities across the country. Without an HOA to enforce arbitrary rules, neighbors began working together to maintain their community voluntarily.